I've kind of talked about it briefly in videos and kind of even quotes or writing on Instagram and on social media about kind of how celibacy is kind of something that takes course when a lot of things happen. And it's primarily a lot of negative things. And I feel like everyone has their own reasons why they decide to kind of get into it or participate in it. And I think this kind of withholding of yourself, not necessarily having, any sexual activity with people, is something that a lot of people are starting to kind of look at now. As common and as popular as I feel like engaging in hookup culture is nowadays, I feel like it definitely is something that's also there is the celibate side of things. And I'm not someone who's always been celibate. I've never fully, fallen into it, or I've never had, this long, confliction with it. But I feel like more recently, within this past year, it's definitely something that I've kind of fallen into. And it's this voluntarily, choosing of withholding yourself from other people. And I feel like it definitely does stem from the risk involved. And it's very interesting to see how, you know, sex nowadays is seen so, you know, less intimate. It's kind of hard to put it into words when you kind of realize that it's now kind of turned into this hobby or performance. And I feel like it almost feels like, everything can be revolved around, sexual attraction or this level of intimacy. Like, this is the final goal. This is something that you have to work so hard for and you have to do to make yourself, to cement yourself, whether it is as a man or as a person or whatever it may be. It's that level of depth that I feel like a lot of people feel is most important, when really I feel like that's nothing further than the truth. And I feel like it has kind of built this false sense of intimacy, in relationships and in connections with people. You kind of start to realize that you don't actually know this person that well. You're kind of just attracted to them, and you're doing these things, and it makes you kind of feel like you're a lot closer than you really are, when really you don't know that person at all. And better yet, I feel like a lot of times it could be used as a reason to kind of not actually get to know people. Like I said earlier about giving it this false sense of intimacy, I feel like a lot of times when people are participating in this stuff, it is kind of this way of getting out of being open and actually expressing themselves and saying how they feel. And I think this is something that's happening a lot. It's something that's very prominent nowadays, is that people will, would much rather participate in this and do these things with other people instead of saying who they are and effectively communicating that. And I'm not here to play, the devil's advocate, or to set myself up and act very pretentious about this, because it is something that I feel like a lot of people are struggling with, including myself. And I feel like the more I've kind of thought about it, the risk and reward and what actually goes into, participating in these things, I've kind of valued celibacy more than anything, because it treats and really tests, I feel like, connections so much harder than it has to. And I think a lot of times, even in my own history, when you kind of rush into sexual things or intimate settings, too fast, it can really damage things. Like I said about giving a false sense of intimacy, it can actually make things feel less romantic when it's purely just that, or it's purely, something that kind of just comes across as sexual. I think it is something that a lot of people have kind of dealt with and are looking at. And I think this is something that people need to realize, that it can be, damaging, that this isn't something that we can just avoid. And I think the biggest thing that is kind of derived from this whole, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you celibate, is that what doesn't kill you part. And that part, I think, is really just experiencing hurt. I think it's a lot easier to realize the dangers that are involved around, these intimate acts when you get hurt. When you experience something that is hurting you, I think that is when you're most likely to decide not to give anyone else, that side of you. And that side of you is so important and it's so sacred that I think we kind of forget that. It definitely is this body is a temple type of thing. And we have to understand that when we allow people to treat it or access it so easily, it definitely says a lot about our own value. And I think this is something that like I said, you're not immediately going to think of. And I think when people are growing up, especially around my age, or around 18 and going up after high school, that a lot of times it's so easy to fall into temptation and the worldliness of things that you kind of forget how important it is to protect yourself in this sense. And that protection isn't necessarily just on a physical sense, but especially an emotional sense. You definitely are creating a tie, maybe not a soul tie, but a connection with this person that will never go away. When you are settled down and with your final partner, you have to realize that all the people that have had access to you still are a part of you now. And I think this is something that we kind of can see differently, or some people might have a different idea or perception about these sexual acts when they do happen. But I do feel like you are kind of creating that. And I feel like the more partners you have, the less intimate, the less special it will be when you do find that person. And it's definitely important to have this level of discipline and withholding yourself from participating in such things, as hard as it may be. But it's important that we try. It's important that we value that side of things, of saying that you are worth so much more than a sexual value for someone. And when you are diminished down to that, and you are diluted down to this kind of strictly lust driven connection, it kind of dehumanizes you in a point. And even for myself in moving on, and I think this is something that a lot of people can realize, it can damage you so much more than you think it has, especially when you're speaking on how you feel and how you want to move about in the world. When you're looking at connections, this side of things, this intimate side, is something that a lot of people are struggling with. Building that level of intimacy isn't something that can merely be achieved with sex. And I think that's something that I've learned over time, is that even though it's one thing to one person, it might be a handshake to another. And it's not necessarily unfortunate, because everyone walks, different walks of life, and they have their own ideas. But when you are trying to feel equally respected and yoked with someone in a relationship, you have to realize that that does say a lot. That can be a driving factor in what hurts, a partner, or what changes a relationship. And I think we have to learn to accept that. That celibacy is something that we have to not necessarily have to participate in, but have to acknowledge. And I think acknowledging that is definitely something that a lot of people are avoiding to do, whether it is, this mere feeling of feeling like it's so much worth more than, this temporary pleasure that it is. And I think a lot of people are so driven that it kind of negates them from even thinking more deeply about it, or they just treat it as, oh no, it's just a whatever thing with this person, or it's not as much or as important as it seems, when really it is. Physically, it is the most intimate thing you can do with someone. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. When you are connecting with someone and you're building, it's not only important to have that emotional aspect of it, but the physical is as important. And I think when you are trying to build this, and it's not really something you're looking at, or you're rushing into these sexual things, or you're not really caring, or being very negligent with it, it just makes it so much easier to get yourself hurt, or to hurt someone else. It can definitely make someone feel used at a time. And I feel like in my own history of trying to find connection and feeling like, any sexual advance would kind of promote that, or progress it, I was gravely mistaken. And I think that hurts people, and it can hurt me too, and it can hurt really anyone involved in it. I think you have to kind of realize that it's not always going to be just whatever to someone. And it's important, and I think we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, because I do definitely promote being very careful with who you allow to have access to, because that connection isn't something that just goes away, despite it being merely just attraction, or by chance, or some one night thing. You have to realize that it is so much more than just that thing. And I think once I kind of fell into that, celibacy was something that I looked at, and it's been almost a year of practicing this, and understanding that it means so much more. And that energy that you are saving for yourself is something that is very important to have, not only for your mind, but your physical body, your spirit, your soul. This is something that I feel like a lot of times has been neglected by people. And we have to understand that everyone can see it differently, but for ourselves, for our own energy, for our own interpretation of these things, we have to be very careful about it. We have to understand the risks that are involved in this, in that when we get hurt in the past, it could definitely be a reason to fall into it, you know? And it's not necessarily bad to be self preserving yourself. It's not bad at all. It's just understanding why and the bigger message and implication that's behind what doesn't kill you. And I think that is the most important part of it, is learning that what you have, what you're protecting, is so much more sacred than this temporary pleasure. And if we want to feel deeper connections, we can't be participating in them so often, because now the value that's instilled in that thing will dissipate. And I think that part of it, that part of allowing anyone to have access to you, makes it feel like anyone will have access to you, can damage you over time. And over time, things become less intimate, things become less special because it's routine for you. And you have to realize that preserving yourself and focusing on the things that do happen and what can hurt you is the most important part of it. That's what we have to do. That's how we have to feel better about ourselves and our own connections.